Dakota Territory, 1896. While his neighbors raced to throw up sod shanties and balloon-frame shacks before the first freeze, Ukrainian homesteader Ivan Petrenko was still digging in late September, 6 feet down into the prairie silt. His fellow settlers called it wasteful. They called him a fool. "Why dig a cellar and call it a house?" they'd ask, watching him crib corners with poplar logs and lay brush lattice for what looked like an underground root cellar. Standard wisdom said, build fast and build high. Get a roof overhead and keep the stove burning. Petrenko built different. A 12 by 16-foot room carved 6 feet into the earth, 18 to 24 inches of sod piled on top. Clay and straw parged thick on the interior walls. 2 weeks of backbreaking work while others finished their homes in half the time. Then January arrived with winds steady at 35 to 45 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to 10 below zero. The above-ground shacks struggled to hold 35 to 40 degrees inside, even with round-the-clock firing. Families huddled in coats beside red-hot stoves, burning through cord after cord of precious wood. But that fool's dugout? 50 to 55 degrees with just an evening fire. What did this Ukrainian immigrant understand about earth, heat, and survival that everyone else dismissed as primitive digging? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The mockery started before Ivan Petrenko's spade hit prairie sod. Word traveled fast through the scattered homesteads of western Dakota Territory that the Ukrainian was planning something foolish, digging his house into the ground like a badger. Abel Klein, the township road overseer who'd built 3 solid sod houses in his time, made sure everyone knew his opinion. 6 feet down is no way to live, he'd tell anyone within earshot at the general store. A man needs to build up, not dig down. Get yourself a decent shanty with 4 walls and a peaked roof, keep that stove burning, and you'll do fine. The other settlers nodded in agreement. They'd arrived with practical knowledge earned through hard seasons on the northern plains. Build fast before the freeze. Cut your sod blocks 36 inches long, lay them grass side down in courses, and get a roof overhead before October. If you had cash for lumber, throw up a balloon frame with board and batten siding, anything to get 4 walls standing and a chimney drawing. The formula was simple. Speed meant survival, and every day spent digging was a day not spent building. But Petrenko had different knowledge, carried from the villages of Galicia, where his grandfather Dmitri Kovalenko had been the settlement's master carpenter. In the old country, when timber was scarce and winters were long, you learned to work with the earth instead of against it. The soil at 6 feet down held steady temperatures year-round, warmer than winter air, cooler than summer heat. A properly built burdei could shelter a family through the worst weather with half the wood their neighbors burned. On September 20th, while morning frost already whitened the grass, Petrenko began laying out his foundation, not above ground but 6 feet below it. His neighbors gathered to watch, shaking their heads as he drove stakes for a 12 by 16-foot rectangle and began the laborious work of excavation. The prairie silt came up in steady spadefuls, creating a growing pile that would later become his roof. 2 feet down, 4 feet, 6 feet deep into the subsoil band where temperatures stayed constant. "That man's digging his own grave," muttered Klein, leaning on his fence rail. "Come January, he'll freeze to death in that hole." Petrenko paid no attention to the commentary. He'd done this before, helping his father build a similar shelter when they first arrived in America 3 years earlier. The physics were simple if you understood them. Soil temperature at depth tracked the annual average with minimal variation. In this latitude, that baseline sat somewhere in the 40s or 50s, a powerful thermal mass compared to air that could swing from 30 above to 20 below zero in a single day. The digging took 12 days with help from his teenage son. They worked methodically, sloping the walls slightly inward and cutting drainage channels that pitched toward daylight at a 1 in 60 fall. No standing water could be tolerated in an earth-sheltered dwelling. Every drop had to find its way out through carefully planned routes. Next came the structural work that separated a proper burdei from a simple dugout. Petrenko cribbed the corners with notched poplar logs, creating a timber frame that would distribute the roof load evenly. He laid shorter logs as purlins, spacing them 18 inches on center across the span. Over these went a lattice of brush and small branches, woven tight enough to support the weight of sod but loose enough to allow air movement. The neighbors continued to watch with a mixture of curiosity and scorn. Anton Brecka, who ran the general store and post office, made regular trips to observe the progress. He kept mental notes on everything, partly from genuine interest, partly because unusual construction methods made for good conversation with customers. "That Ukrainian's still digging," he'd report to anyone who asked. "Got himself a timber frame down there now. Looks like he's building a root cellar and planning to live in it." The most critical element was the wall treatment. Petrenko mixed clay from a nearby creek bed with chopped straw and water, creating a thick paste that he applied to the earth walls in layers 3/4 to 1 inch thick. This parge coat served multiple functions. It sealed air leaks, controlled humidity, created a smooth interior surface, and added thermal mass. The work was tedious, requiring constant attention to thickness and adhesion, but it transformed rough dirt walls into something resembling proper interior finish. Above ground, the construction looked deceptively simple. 18 to 24 inches of prairie sod, laid grass side down in overlapping courses like shingles. The sod blocks were cut from the excavation area, ensuring that the roof materials came directly from the building site. Beneath the sod, the brush lattice distributed weight evenly across the log purlins, which transferred loads to the corner posts and down into the solid earth. The window well required careful attention to drainage and structural integrity. Petrenko framed a 2 by 3 foot opening at grade level, installing it with a slight slope toward the interior to shed precipitation. The glazed window itself was one of his few store-bought items, ordered through Breka's establishment along with stovepipe, hinges, and a small iron stove. By mid-October, the burdei was complete and ready for occupancy. From outside, it looked like little more than a grassy mound with a stovepipe and window protruding from one end. The door was recessed below grade, accessed by wooden steps that Petrenko had carved into the earth and reinforced with split logs. Visitors had to duck their heads entering the low doorway, but once inside, the ceiling height was comfortable enough for a man to stand upright. The interior measured exactly 12 by 16 feet, providing 192 square feet of living space. Not generous by any standard, but adequate for a family of 4 during the winter months when outdoor work was impossible. The earthen floor was crowned slightly for drainage and covered with split log planking in the high traffic areas. A gravel sump beneath the floor collected any moisture that might seep through the walls. Klein made one final inspection before winter set in, accompanied by several other neighbors who were curious to see the finished product. The interior was surprisingly dry and comfortable, with walls that felt solid and well finished. The single window admitted adequate light during daylight hours, and the central positioning of the stove promised even heat distribution. Still, the road overseer remained skeptical. "It's well built, I'll give you that," he admitted. "But when that north wind starts howling and the temperature drops to 20 below, you'll wish you had 4 proper walls above ground like the rest of us." Petrenko simply nodded politely. The real test was still coming, and he was confident in his grandfather's wisdom. The earth would prove itself soon enough. The first principle that Petrenko understood, and his neighbors did not, was that the earth itself was a heating system. 6 feet below the surface, soil temperature followed the annual average rather than daily extremes. While air temperature could plunge from 40 above to 20 below zero in a matter of hours, the subsoil remained remarkably stable. In Dakota territory, that baseline sat consistently in the mid-40s to low 50s, a natural thermal reservoir that required no fuel to maintain. His grandfather Dmitri had explained it simply: the deeper you dig, the smaller the temperature swings become. At 1 foot down, soil temperatures still tracked seasonal changes fairly closely. At 3 feet, the variations dampened considerably. At 6 feet, the earth held steady within a narrow band that represented the mathematical average of all the weather above. It was basic physics that every farmer understood when digging root cellars, but few considered applying to living spaces. The science behind this phenomenon was elegant in its simplicity. Heat moved slowly through soil, taking weeks or months to penetrate to depth. Summer warmth that baked the surface in July wouldn't reach 6 feet down until October or November. Winter cold that froze the ground in December might not affect the deep soil until March or April. This natural time lag meant that subsoil temperatures lagged behind surface conditions by roughly 3 months, creating a thermal battery that stored summer heat for winter use and winter cooling for summer comfort. Petrenko had positioned his dwelling to take maximum advantage of this earth coupling. By placing his living space entirely below the frost line, he eliminated the primary heat loss mechanism that plagued surface buildings. His neighbors' shacks sat fully exposed to winter winds that could strip heat through walls, floors, and ceilings simultaneously. The burdei presented only one face to the weather, the south-facing wall that contained the door and window. The remaining 5 surfaces were surrounded by stable earth that maintained temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the outside air. Wind elimination represented the second major advantage of earth-sheltered construction. Prairie winds were relentless, often sustained at 20 to 30 miles per hour for days at a time during winter storms. Every crack, gap, and imperfect joint in a surface building became a pathway for cold air infiltration. A typical frame house or sod shanty might experience complete air changes every hour or two during windy conditions, forcing the heating system to warm a continuous stream of frigid replacement air. The burdei's recessed design eliminated most wind-driven infiltration. Cold air couldn't pool around the structure because there was no exposed structure to pool around. The single window well was sized at precisely 2 by 3 feet, large enough to provide adequate daylight while small enough to minimize heat loss. The door was positioned below grade in the lee of the earth bank, creating a natural airlock that prevented wind from driving directly into the living space. Interior thermal management relied on carefully calculated thermal mass combined with modest insulation values. Thus, 18 to 24 inches of sod covering the roof provided both functions simultaneously. Sod was not an efficient insulator by modern standards, perhaps equivalent to 3 or 4 inches of fiberglass, but it offered substantial thermal mass. This combination meant that heat moved slowly through the roof assembly, and any heat that did penetrate was absorbed and re-radiated gradually rather than lost immediately to the outside air. The clay straw parge coating on the interior walls served multiple thermal functions. It created an effective air barrier that eliminated drafts from the earth walls. It provided modest insulation value while adding thermal mass near the living space. Most importantly, it created a vapor barrier that controlled humidity without completely blocking moisture movement. The clay could absorb excess humidity when interior conditions were damp, then release it slowly when conditions were dry, maintaining comfortable interior conditions without mechanical ventilation. Heating system design reflected Petrenko's understanding of heat distribution and combustion air management. Instead of placing the stove against an exterior wall like his neighbors did, he positioned it near the center of the room. This central location ensured even heat distribution to all corners of the space while keeping the hottest surfaces away from the earth walls where condensation might occur. The short stovepipe extended just far enough above the sod roof to create adequate draft without overventing heated air. Combustion air entered through a carefully sized vent slot positioned below the eaves on the leeward side of the structure. This 2 by 8 inch opening provided approximately 16 square inches of free area, enough to supply the stove with adequate oxygen without creating excessive air movement. The vent's leeward position prevented wind from driving cold air directly into the living space, while ensuring steady airflow for proper combustion. The window well incorporated passive solar principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by building science for another century. Positioned on the south face and sized at approximately 8 to 10% of the floor area, the glazing admitted low-angle winter sunlight that penetrated deep into the interior space. The thermal mass of the earth walls and floor absorbed this solar energy during sunny days and released it slowly during the night, reducing heating requirements without any additional fuel consumption. Moisture control was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the design. The crowned earthen floor shed any surface water toward the perimeter drain, while the gravel sump beneath the floor provided a reservoir for groundwater that might seep through the walls. The drain trench pitched at 1 in 60 carried this water to daylight, preventing the accumulation that would make the space uninhabitable. The clay parge coating breathed enough to prevent vapor buildup while remaining tight enough to block air infiltration. Stack effect management prevented the common problem of overventing that plagued many surface dwellings. Tall chimneys created strong draft that pulled heated air out of living spaces faster than it could be replaced by warmed air. The burdei's short stack and controlled air inlet created just enough draft for clean combustion without excessive heat loss through the chimney. This balance was critical in a climate where every BTU counted and fuel was both expensive and labor-intensive to obtain. The integrated design meant that each element supported the others in maintaining comfortable conditions. The thermal mass absorbed heat during firing periods and released it gradually during non-firing periods. The earth coupling provided a warm baseline that reduced heating requirements. The wind protection eliminated infiltration losses. The controlled ventilation supplied combustion air without over-ventilating the space. The result was a structure that could maintain 50 to 60 degree interior temperatures with perhaps one-third the fuel consumption of comparable surface dwellings. This systematic approach to thermal performance reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom from regions where fuel was scarce and winters were harsh. Petrenko was applying proven technology, not experimenting with untested methods. The physics were well understood by anyone who had lived in earth-sheltered dwellings, even if the scientific principles wouldn't be formally codified until the 20th century. Energy efficiency movement rediscovered the advantages of earth-coupled construction. The blizzard arrived without warning on January 15, 1897. Anton Breka was closing his store when the wind shifted from southwest to northwest and the temperature began dropping like a stone. Within 2 hours, what had been a mild winter day at 20 above zero had become a howling nightmare at 10 below, with winds gusting past 40 miles per hour. Snow fell so thick it was impossible to see the barn from the house, and drifts began forming faster than anyone could shovel them clear. This was no ordinary winter storm. The weather pattern that meteorologists would later classify as an Arctic outbreak had locked into place across the northern Great Plains, bringing with it the kind of sustained cold that tested every structure, every heating system, and every fuel supply in the territory. For 6 straight days, daytime temperatures never rose above zero. Nighttime lows plunged to 25 below, with winds that never dropped below 30 miles per hour. It was the kind of weather that revealed the fatal flaws in marginal construction and inadequate preparation. Abel Klein felt the crisis first. His well-built sod house had weathered 3 previous winters without major problems, but this storm was different. By the second night, frost was forming on the interior walls despite the red-hot stove that consumed nearly half a quart of wood every week. The wind found every imperfection in the sod joints, every gap around the door frame, every crack in the chimney mortar. Cold air poured in through dozens of tiny openings while heated air rushed out through the same pathways. His morning routine became a study in futility. Load the firebox at midnight before bed, wake at 4 to reload it, rise at 6 to find the interior temperature had dropped to 35 degrees. By dawn, ice was forming on the nails that secured the interior board paneling. Behind the bed, where his wife and children huddled under every blanket they owned, frost accumulated on the wall in crystalline patterns that grew thicker each night. The Klein family was burning through their winter wood supply at an alarming rate. What should have lasted until March was disappearing by New Year's at the current consumption rate. Each morning brought the same desperate calculation: how much wood to burn to keep the family alive versus how much to save for the remainder of the winter. There was no good answer. Too little fuel meant freezing. Too much meant running out before spring. Similar scenes played out across every homestead in the township. The Anderson family, living in a hastily built balloon frame house, watched helplessly as their interior temperature dropped to 38 degrees despite continuous firing of their cast iron stove. Wind-driven snow found its way through the board and batten siding, creating small drifts inside the house that had to be swept out each morning. Their consumption spiked to more than a quart every month, an unsustainable rate that would exhaust their supply by February. The Mueller family had built what everyone considered the finest house in the area, a substantial frame structure with proper foundation, double-hung windows, and a brick chimney. Yet even their superior construction couldn't overcome the physics of the storm. Interior temperatures fluctuated wildly between 45 degrees near the stove and 28 degrees in the corners farthest from the heat source. They were burning nearly 4 cords of wood per month, more than twice their planned consumption rate. Throughout this ordeal, smoke continued to rise steadily from the barely visible chimney of Petrenko's burdei. Neighbors who ventured out to check their livestock or retrieve more firewood noticed that the Ukrainian stovepipe showed none of the heavy, continuous discharge that characterized their own desperate efforts to maintain livable temperatures. His fire seemed to burn intermittently, like someone who had fuel to spare and time to manage it carefully. On the third night of the storm, when outside temperatures reached 25 below zero and winds gusted past 45 miles per hour, desperation drove Abel Klein to make an unprecedented decision. His own house had become uninhabitable. Despite continuous firing, the interior temperature had dropped to 32 degrees, cold enough for ice to form in the water bucket. His wife was showing early signs of exposure, and his youngest child had developed a cough that worsened each night. Swallowing his pride and his previous criticism, Klein bundled his family in every available blanket and fought through drifts that reached his chest to knock on Petrenko's door. The Ukrainian answered immediately, unsurprised by the late-night visit. Without a word of reproach, he stepped aside to let the family enter his underground shelter. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. While the wind howled across the prairie above their heads, the interior of the burdei felt calm and genuinely warm. Klein's spirit thermometer, which he had brought to verify what his body already told him, read 52 degrees. The air was still, free of the drafts that made his own house unbearable. Most remarkably, the stove contained only a modest fire, clearly adequate to maintain comfortable conditions without the desperate overfeeding that characterized every other dwelling in the township. Within hours, 2 more families had arrived seeking shelter. The Kovals, whose frame house had become uninhabitable when the chimney developed a crack that filled the interior with smoke, brought their infant daughter and requested space on the floor. The Johnsons, whose sod house had developed ice dams that caused interior flooding, asked permission to stay until the storm passed. Petrenko accommodated them all, demonstrating that his 12 by 16-foot space could shelter more people than anyone had imagined possible. The logistics of housing multiple families in such tight quarters should have been impossible, but the stable temperature and absence of drafts made close quarters tolerable. Children who had been shivering uncontrollably in their own homes fell asleep easily on pallets spread across the earthen floor. Adults who had spent days huddled around inadequate stoves found they could move freely throughout the space without encountering pockets of frigid air. Most telling was the fuel consumption. Throughout the 6-day crisis, Petrenko's wood usage remained consistent with normal winter operations, perhaps half a cord per month based on the size of his modest woodpile and the frequency of his restocking trips to the shed. Meanwhile, his neighbors were burning through their supplies at rates that would exhaust their fuel stocks before February ended. The mathematics were simple and undeniable. The burdei was achieving superior performance while consuming drastically less fuel. When the storm finally broke on January 21st, the contrast became visible to anyone willing to make the comparison. Surface dwellings showed the obvious signs of thermal stress. Ice formations around windows and doors, frost damage to interior finishes, and the telltale signs of overfiring in chimney conditions and ash accumulation. The burdei showed none of these symptoms. Its interior remained comfortable, dry, and stable throughout the ordeal. The crisis had provided the definitive test that separated theory from practice. Under extreme conditions that pushed every heating system to its limits, the earth-sheltered design had proven its superiority in the most objective way possible by keeping people alive and comfortable while using less fuel than structures that failed to provide adequate shelter. Anton Brecka had always been a man who paid attention to numbers. As both storekeeper and postmaster, he tracked every cord of wood sold, every stovepipe replaced, every pane of window glass ordered through his establishment. The brutal January storm had provided him with the kind of data that settled arguments definitively, and he began compiling his observations with the methodical precision of a bookkeeper recording inventory. The wood sales told the most compelling story. Throughout December and the first half of January, before the Great Storm, fuel consumption across the township had followed predictable patterns. The Anderson family, living in their balloon frame house, purchased 1 1/4 cords per month through Brecka's supplier. The Mullers, with their substantial 2-story frame construction, bought 1 1/2 cords monthly. Abel Klein, whose sod house was considered well built by local standards, required just over 1 cord per month under normal winter conditions. Petrenko's purchases stood out dramatically in Brecka's ledger. Through December and early January, the Ukrainian had bought exactly 1/2 cord of split oak and ash, enough wood to last other families perhaps 2 weeks of ordinary heating. Yet his chimney showed consistent, moderate smoke output, and visitors to his underground dwelling reported comfortable interior conditions throughout the period. The crisis week had accelerated everyone's consumption to unsustainable levels, but the ratios remained consistent and revealing. Klein had burned through nearly a full cord during the 6-day storm, desperately feeding his stove around the clock in a futile attempt to maintain livable temperatures. The Anderson family consumed 3/4 of a cord during the same period, while the Mullers went through a full cord trying to heat their larger house. Neighbors were calculating that at storm consumption rates, their winter fuel supplies would be exhausted by early February. Petrenko's consumption during the crisis had been precisely measured by several witnesses who sheltered with him. He had loaded his stove with split wood 3 times daily, morning, evening, and a final loading before bed. Each loading consisted of 4 to 6 pieces of seasoned hardwood, roughly equivalent to 1/8 cord over the 6-day period. His total storm consumption was less than 1/4 cord, while maintaining interior temperatures that never dropped below 50 degrees. The temperature measurements provided equally dramatic evidence. Brecka had distributed several spirit thermometers to neighbors during the crisis, creating a network of observation points that documented the performance differences with scientific precision. Klein's sod house, despite continuous firing, recorded interior temperatures ranging from 32 degrees at dawn to 45 degrees during peak firing periods. The average interior temperature throughout the storm was 38 degrees. The Anderson balloon frame house performed slightly better, maintaining temperatures between 35 degrees at dawn and 48 degrees during active firing. Their average interior temperature was 42 degrees, achieved through consumption rates that would bankrupt most families if sustained. The Muller house, despite superior construction and massive fuel consumption, averaged only 46 degrees interior temperature with wild variations between heated and unheated areas. Petrenko's burdei maintained remarkably stable conditions throughout the crisis. Morning readings consistently showed 50 to 52 degrees, while evening temperatures after cooking fires reached 58 to 62 degrees. The daily average temperature was 55 degrees with minimal variation, warmer than his neighbors achieved during their peak firing periods and accomplished with fuel consumption rates that were sustainable indefinitely. The construction costs revealed another dimension of the burdei's practical advantages. Brecka's records showed that Petrenko had purchased less than 150 board feet of sawn lumber for his entire project, primarily door and window framing materials, plus short joist planks for specific structural connections. His total cash outlay for purchased materials was $6.37, covering window glass, hinges, nails, stovepipe sections, and the small iron stove itself. Labor requirements had been substantial but entirely within the capability of one man and a helper. Brecka had observed the construction process and estimated the total work at approximately 130 man-hours from initial excavation through final finishing. This compared favorably to frame construction, which required similar labor inputs plus significantly higher material costs. A comparable frame house would have required at least 300 board feet of lumber, plus siding, roofing materials, and foundation work that easily tripled the cash investment. The maintenance requirements were proving equally modest. After 18 months of occupancy, Petrenko had resodded portions of his roof during the previous spring, work that took 2 days and cost nothing except labor. He had patched several small areas of interior clay parge where minor cracking had occurred after the spring thaw, a task requiring perhaps 4 hours and materials available on any homestead. Durability projections based on similar construction in the old country suggested that the sod roof would require partial renewal every 2 to 3 years, while the clay parge would need attention annually after freeze-thaw cycles. The log cribbing and structural elements should last decades with minimal maintenance, protected as they were from weather exposure and ground contact. The mathematical comparison was overwhelming and undeniable. During the coldest 12 weeks of winter, when heating demands peaked and fuel costs mattered most, the burdei consumed 1½ cords of firewood while maintaining superior interior comfort. Comparable surface dwellings consumed 3 to 4 cords during the same period while failing to provide adequate warmth for their occupants. Converting these figures to British thermal units made the efficiency differences even more striking. Each cord of mixed hardwood contained approximately 24 million BTUs of available energy. The burdei was extracting useful heat from 36 million BTUs per winter, while surface dwellings required 72 to 96 million BTUs to achieve inferior results. The earth-shelter design was operating at roughly double the thermal efficiency of conventional construction. The mechanism behind these numbers was now clear to anyone who cared to understand it. The stable earth coupling provided a thermal baseline that eliminated the need to heat interior air from sub-zero starting points. The eliminated wind infiltration prevented heated air from being continuously replaced by frigid outside air. The thermal mass of the sod roof and clay walls absorbed heat during firing periods and released it gradually, extending the useful output from each stick of wood burned. Brecka's documentation extended beyond thermal performance to include practical observations about daily life in the earth-sheltered dwelling. Humidity levels remained comfortable without mechanical ventilation, courtesy of the clay parge that absorbed excess moisture and released it gradually. Interior air quality was excellent despite the tight construction, thanks to controlled ventilation that supplied combustion air without overventing heated air. Storage and workspace were adequate for a family of 4, with built-in advantages that surface dwellings couldn't match. Root vegetables could be stored directly in the earth walls, maintaining ideal temperature and humidity without separate root cellars. The stable interior temperature made the space suitable for tasks like bread rising, cheese making, and other food preparation that required consistent conditions. The numbers told a story that transcended individual preference or cultural bias. Under identical weather conditions, using comparable fuel types, the earth-sheltered design had demonstrated measurably superior performance while requiring lower initial investment and minimal ongoing maintenance. The physics were working exactly as Petrenko's grandfather had promised they would, validated now by precise measurement and direct comparison. This quantified evidence was beginning to change minds throughout the township, transforming what had been dismissed as primitive foolishness into recognized practical wisdom, worthy of adoption by anyone serious about surviving northern plains, winters efficiently and economically. By spring of 1897, Abel Klein had swallowed enough pride to ask even Petrenko for construction advice. The road overseer who had once dismissed the burdei as no way to live now found himself sketching plans for his own earth-sheltered addition. His sod house had consumed nearly 5 cords of wood during the brutal winter, more than double his budget and triple what Petrenko had burned while maintaining superior comfort. The mathematics were undeniable, and Klein was a practical man who learned from costly mistakes. Petrenko walked the site with Klein in late March, when the frost was coming out of the ground, and excavation would be possible. They selected a location 30 yards from the existing house, positioned to take advantage of the slight southern slope that would aid drainage. The plan called for a semi-dugout kitchen and root cellar combination, 6 feet deep like Petrenko's dwelling, but with a more conventional above-ground kitchen area connected by interior stairs to the underground storage space. The Koval family had already begun their own earth-sheltered project, having witnessed firsthand the thermal performance that saved their lives during the January crisis. Marta and Oleksiy Koval chose a different approach, planning a fully underground dwelling similar to Petrenko's original design but larger, 14 by 20 feet, to accommodate their growing family. They broke ground in early April, as soon as the soil was workable, determined to have their burdei completed before the following winter. Word of the construction project spread quickly through the township and beyond. Father Dmitri Kovalenko, the Ukrainian Catholic priest who served the scattered immigrant communities, noted the change in attitude in his parish records. The families who once mocked the old country ways now seek instruction in proper burdei construction, he wrote in his weekly report to the bishop. What our grandfathers knew from necessity, these Dakota pioneers are learning from desperation. Anton Brecka found himself in the unexpected position of technical consultant, fielding questions about materials and measurements from neighbors who had previously shown no interest in Petrenko's methods. How deep should the excavation extend? What type of wood worked best for the cribbing? Where could clay suitable for parge coating be found locally? The storekeeper maintained careful notes on these consultations, recognizing that he was documenting the transfer of traditional building knowledge to American frontier conditions. The Anderson family opted for a hybrid approach that combined earth sheltering with conventional framing. They planned to bank earth around 3 sides of their existing balloon frame house, creating a partial burdei effect while preserving the interior space they were accustomed to. The project would require substantial excavation and retaining walls, but promised significant fuel savings without the psychological adjustment of moving completely underground. By midsummer, 5 separate earth-sheltered projects were under construction within a 3-mile radius of Petrenko's original dwelling. Each family adapted the basic concept to their specific needs and resources. The Millers designed an ambitious complex with both underground storage and living areas connected by covered passages. The Johnsons planned a simple dugout workshop that could serve as emergency shelter during extreme weather events. The construction techniques spread organically through direct observation and informal instruction. Petrenko shared his knowledge freely, understanding that widespread adoption would validate his grandfather's wisdom and perhaps preserve traditional methods for future generations. He demonstrated the proper consistency for clay straw parge, the optimal spacing for log purlins, and the critical importance of drainage systems that carried moisture away from underground spaces. Technical innovations emerged as American conditions differed from Old World applications. Dakota winters were longer and more severe than those in Galicia, requiring deeper excavations and thicker sod roofs. Local clay deposits had different working properties than European materials, necessitating adjustments to parge mixtures and application techniques. Prairie winds were more constant and powerful, demanding careful attention to air sealing and infiltration control. The township's livestock also benefited from earth-sheltered principles. Several farmers began banking earth around their barns and livestock shelters, recognizing that the same thermal advantages that warmed human dwellings could reduce animal mortality and feed consumption. Cattle that had previously required constant shelter and supplemental feeding during extreme cold could now survive harsh weather with minimal intervention. Father Kowalski documented the broader cultural implications of the building revival in his correspondence with other Ukrainian settlements across the northern plains. The American neighbors who once laughed at our earth houses now asked to learn our methods, he reported. Some speak of the old country ways with new respect, acknowledging wisdom they had dismissed as primitive ignorance. The priest noted that intermarriage between Ukrainian and German immigrant families was increasing, often facilitated by shared interest in practical building techniques that transcended ethnic boundaries. By the winter of 1898, the thermal performance of the new earth-sheltered dwellings validated Petrenko's predictions completely. The Koval family's enlarged burdei maintained interior temperatures of 52 to 58 degrees throughout the coldest weeks, while consuming less than 2 cords of wood for the entire heating season. Klein's hybrid kitchen-cellar combination reduced his main house heating load by an estimated 30%, allowing him to heat both structures with less fuel than his original sod house had required alone. The construction methods began appearing in other townships as families relocated or shared information through church networks and family connections. Ukrainian settlements in Billings and McKenzie counties documented similar earth-sheltered construction projects, creating a regional building tradition that combined Old World knowledge with frontier practicality. The techniques spread beyond Ukrainian communities as German, Norwegian, and even native-born American families recognized the economic advantages of fuel-efficient construction. Anton Brecka's business records showed the measurable impact of widespread earth-sheltered construction. Wood sales in the township dropped by approximately 25% between 1897 and 1899, even as the population increased through new homestead entries. Families were achieving superior comfort while consuming dramatically less fuel, demonstrating that Petrenko's methods scaled effectively across different family sizes and construction variations. The long-term legacy of the burdei movement extended far beyond individual fuel savings. As frame houses replaced the original earth-sheltered dwellings during prosperous periods, many families retained their underground spaces as root cellars and storm shelters. The stable temperatures that had provided thermal comfort continued to preserve food stores and protect families during severe weather events. Petrenko's original dwelling served the family for 12 years before they built a conventional frame house above ground. But the burdei remained in use as a root cellar, maintaining steady temperatures of 45 to 55 degrees year-round that preserved vegetables, dairy products, and preserved meats without artificial refrigeration. The same thermal properties that had revolutionized heating efficiency proved equally valuable for food storage, providing economic benefits that extended throughout the growing season. When timber became scarce and wind remained free, the cheapest heat was indeed the heat you didn't have to make. The earth itself became the heating system, requiring only human knowledge to unlock its potential for those wise enough to build with natural forces rather than against them.